In a dim room in first-century Rome, a young slave sat with his leg locked inside a wooden device, while his master twisted it slowly, testing how far the joint could bend before it gave way. The slave did not scream. He did not beg. He watched his own limb with the calm curiosity of a man observing an experiment that did not belong to him. His name was Epictetus, and he had already decided, long before this moment, that his body was not truly his to protect. Only his mind was. What happened next would become one of the most quietly devastating stories in the history of philosophy, not because of the cruelty of the master, but because of the composure of the slave. This is not a story about suffering. It is a story about the astonishing discovery that a person can be owned in body and still remain, in every way that matters, entirely free. To understand how a broken leg became one of the greatest teachings in Western thought, we have to go back to where Epictetus began, with nothing at all. Epictetus was born around 55 AD in Hierapolis, a Greek city in the region of Phrygia, in what is now Turkey. His name was not even his own. Epictetus simply means acquired or gained, the label given to property. He was born into slavery, with no record of his birth name, no family history preserved, no inheritance except the body he was given. As a child, he was taken to Rome and sold into the household of Epictetus, a wealthy freedman who himself had once been a slave before rising to become a powerful secretary to Emperor Nero. Epictetus was known for his ambition and his temper, and slaves in his household lived under the constant threat of his moods. Yet somehow, in this environment of fear and unpredictability, young Epictetus was permitted to attend lectures given by the Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus. Perhaps his master saw it as a harmless indulgence, or perhaps he simply didn't notice. Either way, it was in those lecture halls, sitting among free citizens as a slave with no rights of his own, that Epictetus began building something no chain could touch, an inner fortress of thought. Musonius Rufus taught a demanding, practical philosophy, Stoicism not as abstract theory, but as a discipline for daily living. He insisted that philosophy was useless unless it changed how a person acted, suffered, and responded to hardship. For a slave like Epictetus, this teaching was not academic. It was survival. He could not control his master's temper. He could not control being bought, sold, beaten, or humiliated. But he began to notice something remarkable in Musonius's teaching. While his body belonged to Epictetus, his judgments, his opinions, his inner reactions to events, these belonged to no one but himself. This idea, small and quiet at first, would eventually become the foundation of everything Epictetus later taught the world. He started practicing it not as a comforting belief, but as a rigorous mental exercise, testing it against the daily indignities of his condition. Each insult, each order, each cruelty became an opportunity to ask one question: is this within my control, or is it not? It was in this crucible of servitude, not in comfort, that the philosophy was forged and tested against real stakes. Then came the day that would define his legacy forever. According to accounts preserved by later writers, Epictetus, in one of his cruel moods, decided to torment his slave by twisting his leg in a restraining device, perhaps to punish him, perhaps merely to amuse himself with the display of power. As the pressure increased, Epictetus is said to have remained calm, watching his own leg with the detachment of a philosopher observing a natural phenomenon rather than a man in his own body experiencing pain. He reportedly told his master, without anger or panic in his voice, simply this: if you keep twisting it, you will break it. Epictetus, perhaps enraged by the lack of fear, perhaps simply indifferent, continued anyway, and the leg broke. Epictetus, according to the story, did not scream, did not curse his master, did not beg for mercy even as the bone gave way. He is said to have responded with the same calm tone: there, I told you it would break. It was not defiance for its own sake. It was proof, lived out in his own flesh, of the very philosophy he had been quietly building inside himself. That moment became the seed of one of the most influential ideas in all of philosophy, the dichotomy of control. Epictetus would later teach that everything in existence falls into one of two categories. Some things are up to us: our judgments, our desires, our reactions, our will. Other things are not up to us: our bodies, our reputations, our possessions, other people's actions, even the length of our own lives. Suffering, he argued, comes not from events themselves but from mistaking one category for the other, from believing we can control what we cannot, and therefore living in constant anxiety and disappointment. His broken leg was not a tragedy to be raged against, because the leg itself was never fully his to protect. What was his, entirely and unshakably, was how he chose to meet the pain. This was not a philosophy of passive endurance or emotional suppression. It was an active, disciplined redirection of energy, away from what cannot be changed and toward what can always be mastered, the self. A slave with a shattered leg had just outlined a freedom no empire could touch. For the rest of his life, Epictetus walked with a permanent limp, a lasting mark of that day. Some accounts suggest the injury may simply have worsened over time rather than resulting from one dramatic incident, but the essence of the story, that his body suffered while his mind remained sovereign, endured because it captured something true about the man himself. Eventually, Epictetus gained his freedom. Historians are not entirely certain when or how, but by the time Nero died in 68 AD, throwing Rome into chaos and civil war, Epictetus was no longer enslaved. He began to study philosophy more formally, and eventually began teaching it himself, first informally, then as a recognized voice in Roman intellectual circles. It is a striking detail of history that the man born with the least freedom of anyone in his household would go on to become one of freedom's most profound teachers. He did not preach comfort. He preached clarity, the difference between what happens to us and what we choose to do about it. Epictetus began teaching openly in Rome, attracting students not through wealth or status, since he possessed neither, but through the sheer force and clarity of his ideas. He lived with almost nothing, a simple lamp, a mat, a modest home, and he made his poverty part of his teaching, showing his students that a fulfilled life required far less than society insisted it did. His lectures were blunt, sometimes almost harsh, cutting through the excuses people made for their own unhappiness. He had little patience for students who complained about circumstances while refusing to examine their own judgments about those circumstances. Word of his teaching spread, and soon he was known throughout Rome as one of the most respected Stoic voices of his generation, a remarkable transformation for a man once considered property, without even a name of his own. But his growing influence would soon put him in danger, because in Rome, ideas that made people question authority, comfort, and fear were never entirely safe to teach, no matter how quietly you lived. In 93 AD, the Emperor Domitian, increasingly paranoid and hostile toward intellectuals who questioned imperial power, issued an edict banishing all philosophers from Rome. Philosophy itself had become politically dangerous, seen as a breeding ground for dissent against the emperor's authority. Epictetus, along with many other teachers, was forced to leave the city that had once enslaved him and later celebrated him. He could have seen this as the ultimate injustice, exiled twice now, once by circumstance of birth, once by imperial decree. Instead, he traveled to Nicopolis, a Greek city on the western coast, and there, far from the center of Roman power, he founded his own school of philosophy. Rather than mourning what he had lost, he built something new, entirely on his own terms. Students began traveling from across the empire to study under him, drawn by his reputation as a teacher who had lived his philosophy rather than merely theorized about it. In exile, stripped once again of his former life, Epictetus demonstrated the very lesson born from his broken leg. Circumstances change, but the discipline of the mind travels with you everywhere. It was in Nicopolis that Epictetus's most famous student, a young Roman named Arian, began attending his lectures and, crucially, began writing them down. Epictetus himself never wrote a single word of philosophy for publication. He believed philosophy should be lived, not merely recorded on paper. Everything we know of his teaching survives only because Arian sat quietly among the students, transcribing his master's words as faithfully as he could, compiling them eventually into two works, the extensive discourses and the shorter, more concentrated Enchiridion, or handbook. Without Arian's diligence, the voice of a former slave might have vanished entirely from history, drowned out by emperors and generals whose names filled the official records instead. Instead, this modest handbook of practical philosophy would go on to survive nearly 2,000 years, studied by soldiers, statesmen, and ordinary people alike. It is a striking irony that a man who owned nothing, wrote nothing, and sought no legacy for himself became one of the most quoted philosophers in human history, purely because someone else recognized the value of simply writing down what he said. Nearly a century later, the teachings born from a broken leg in a slave's quarters would reach the most powerful man in the entire world. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, carried a copy of Epictetus's teachings with him during his military campaigns along the Danube frontier, reading them by candlelight in his tent between battles. In his own private journal, later known as Meditations, Marcus quotes Epictetus directly, referring to him with clear reverence as a guide for how to endure hardship, loss, and the crushing pressures of command. Think of the strange symmetry of this. The most powerful man in the Roman world, wearing the finest armor money could produce, commanding armies with a single word, found his deepest source of guidance in the recorded thoughts of a man who had once been considered less than a person under Roman law. Power had not made Marcus free from suffering, and slavery had not prevented Epictetus from achieving it. The emperor needed the slave's wisdom more than the slave had ever needed the emperor's permission to think. At the heart of everything Epictetus taught was a single, deceptively simple distinction, and it is worth returning to it directly, because it is the entire key to understanding why his story still matters today. He divided all of existence into two piles. In one pile, your opinions, your goals, your desires, your aversions, your judgments about what things mean, in short, your own mind. In the other pile, your body, your wealth, your reputation, your career, other people's opinions of you, even life and death themselves. He argued, with total conviction, that peace of mind comes only from investing your energy entirely in the first pile and releasing your grip entirely on the second. Not because the second pile doesn't matter, but because gripping tightly to things outside your control is the direct and reliable cause of nearly all human anxiety, anger, and despair. His leg was in the second pile. His response to the pain was in the first. He lost the leg. He never once lost himself. It would be easy to romanticize the story, to imagine that Epictetus felt no pain, no fear, no resentment at all. But that misses the deeper point of his teaching entirely. Stoicism, as he taught it, was never about the absence of feeling. It was about the refusal to let feeling dictate judgment, and judgment dictate suffering beyond what was necessary. He almost certainly felt the pain of his broken leg intensely, as any human body would. What he refused to do was add a second layer of suffering on top of it. The layer created by resentment, by the belief that the world owed him something different, by the endless replaying of "this should not be happening to me." This is the discipline he practiced daily, long before the leg broke, and continued practicing long after as an exile, as a teacher, as an old man walking with a permanent limp through the streets of a foreign Greek city. The wisdom was never a trick to avoid pain. It was a method for refusing to let pain multiply itself into despair. Epictetus died sometime around 135 AD, likely in Nicopolis, having lived long enough to see his teachings spread quietly but persistently across the Roman world. He left behind no property of significance, no grand monument, no family estate, appropriately, since he had spent his entire adult life demonstrating that such things were never the source of a meaningful existence. What he did leave behind was a body of ideas so precisely and practically constructed that they would go on to influence not only Marcus Aurelius, but countless generations of thinkers, soldiers, prisoners, and ordinary people who found themselves facing circumstances they could not change. His life reads almost like a deliberate philosophical experiment. Strip a man of every external advantage, freedom, family, wealth, even the full use of his own body, and see what remains. What remained, in his case, was clarity, discipline, and a form of freedom that no master, no emperor, and no broken bone could ever confiscate. It is perhaps the most complete demonstration in recorded history that dignity is not granted by circumstance, but built entirely from within. Today, nearly 2,000 years later, we rarely face the literal chains Epictetus endured, but we face our own versions of the same struggle constantly. We rage at traffic we cannot control. We lose sleep over other people's opinions of us, opinions we have no real power to change. We tie our sense of worth to promotions, diagnoses, market fluctuations, and other people's choices. All things firmly in the second pile, the pile that was never ours to command. Epictetus would not tell us to stop caring about these things entirely, nor to pretend they don't matter. He would ask a simpler, sharper question, the same one he likely asked himself as his leg was twisted nearly 2 millennia ago. Is this within my control, or is it not? And if the honest answer is not, then the suffering we add on top of the situation, the resentment, the panic, the endless replaying, becomes optional, a second wound we choose to inflict on ourselves entirely voluntarily. That recognition, simple as it sounds, was enough to make a slave unbreakable. The next time something happens to you that you cannot change, a delayed flight, a harsh email, a diagnosis, a loss you did not choose, pause before reacting and ask Epictetus's question honestly. Separate what is actually yours to influence from what has already been decided by forces outside your hands. Direct all your energy toward the first, and consciously release your grip on the second, not out of resignation, but out of clarity. This will not stop the difficult things from happening. It will not fix a broken leg, a broken plan, or a broken heart, but it will stop you from breaking twice. A man once wrote, from a place of complete powerlessness, that we suffer not from events themselves but from our opinions about them. He proved it with his own body, calmly, without theatrics, in a small Roman room nearly 2,000 years ago. The chain is not always visible, but neither, if you choose it, is the freedom.